Elena had never believed in fairy tales until Adrian. Standing at the altar, bathed in soft golden light, she had clutched his hands and promised forever. His gaze, warm and unwavering, had made her believe in love. Real love. The kind that didn't end, didn't break. The kind that made vows more than just words. Their wedding was perfect. The laughter of friends, the soft melodies of a string quartet, the way Adrian whispered in her ear, "I can't wait to call you my wife." And later that night, wrapped in his arms, she had never felt safer. But when she woke up, he was gone. The sheets beside her were cold. The soft hum of the city outside the window felt eerily loud. Elena reached for him instinctively, her hand landing on emptiness. "Adrian." Her voice was thick with sleep, confusion threading through her drowsiness. No answer. She sat up, her fingers searching for her phone. 2:47 a.m. Had he gone to get water? Maybe he was in the bathroom? She slid out of bed, wrapping the hotel robe around her, her bare feet silent against the plush carpet. The bathroom door was open. Empty. The suite was silent. Something was wrong. Her heart started to pound as she checked the living area. No sign of him. His tuxedo jacket was draped over the chair where he had tossed it, but his shoes were gone. His phone missing. Her breath came faster. This wasn't right. Adrian wasn't the kind of man to just leave. Not without a word. Not on their wedding night. She called his number. Straight to voicemail. Her fingers trembled as she dialed again. And again. Still nothing. By the time morning light filtered through the curtains, Elena was curled up on the couch, staring at the door, willing it to open. But Adrian never came back. And just like that, the fairy tale ended before it even began. Elena refused to believe it. She checked her phone again, scrolling through unanswered messages, missed calls, and the cold silence of voicemail after voicemail. Something must have happened. There had to be an explanation, an emergency, an accident, something. Still dressed in her wedding gown from the night before, she ran down to the hotel reception. The clerk gave her a concerned look. "My husband, Adrian Carter. Did he leave the hotel last night?" The man hesitated before checking the logs. "Mr. Carter left around 2:30 a.m. Elena's stomach twisted. "Alone?" "Yes, ma'am." He walked out through the main entrance. He didn't say anything to the staff. Her hands went numb. Walked out? Alone? Without telling her? Her mind whirled with possibilities. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he had a panic attack. Maybe this was some kind of mistake. She dialed his number again. Straight to voicemail. By noon, panic had settled deep in her bones. The wedding venue, his friends, even the hospital, nowhere had any trace of Adrian. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Then came the hardest part, the call to his mother. "Elena, sweetheart." Mrs. Carter's warm voice greeted her. "I was just about to call. How's my son treating you? Where are you two off to for the honeymoon?" Elena's throat closed up. She had no idea what to say, how to explain that her husband, the man who had promised her forever, had disappeared on their wedding night. "Mrs. Carter," she whispered, gripping the phone tightly. "Adrian is missing." Silence. Then a slow, cautious reply. "What do you mean, missing?" "He left in the middle of the night," Elena said, her voice cracking. "I don't know where he is. I can't reach him." Another pause. This time longer. When Mrs. Carter spoke again, her voice was different. Less shocked, more guarded. "Elena, honey, are you sure you looked everywhere?" Elena's blood ran cold. It wasn't the reaction she expected. No panic. No desperate questions. Just careful, measured words. Something was wrong. Her mind spun with suspicion, but before she could push for more, Mrs. Carter said softly, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'm sure Adrian has his reasons." Elena's breath caught. His reasons? A sigh. "Just wait a little longer. He'll come back." Elena wanted to scream. Come back? What kind of mother acted this calm when her son had disappeared without a trace? The call ended, but her doubts only grew. Adrian wasn't just gone. Someone knew why, and they weren't telling her. The days after Adrian's disappearance blurred together in a haze of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. Elena barely left the hotel room at first, waiting, hoping that he'd return. But he never did. The police labeled him as a voluntary disappearance. There was no evidence of foul play, no threats, no struggle. He simply walked away. His bank accounts remained untouched. His phone was never found. It was as if the man she loved had never existed. Her heart ached, but the worst part was the whispers. Maybe he got cold feet. Did you really know him, Elena? What if he was hiding something all along? Even Adrian's own mother refused to search for him. She never called again, never reached out. Elena was left alone to pick up the pieces of a marriage that had shattered before it even began. 1 year later, the wedding dress was still hanging in her closet, untouched, wrapped in plastic. A ghost of a night she couldn't erase. Elena wasn't the same woman who had walked down the aisle with dreams of forever. She had changed, became colder, more distant. The pain of Adrian's abandonment had hardened something inside her. She had stopped waiting, stopped searching. Because what was the point of chasing a ghost? And then, just when she had finally started to move on, she saw him. Or, at least, a man who looked exactly like him. She had been on her way to a cafe when she caught a glimpse of those eyes. That familiar stance. The way his fingers curled around his coffee cup, just like Adrian used to. Her heart stopped. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. She turned, breathless, pushing through the crowd. Adrian. The man froze. For a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker across his face. Shock. Guilt. Something she couldn't name. Then, just like before, he ran. Elena's feet moved before her mind caught up. Adrian, she shouted, shoving past pedestrians. The man, her husband, her missing husband, turned the corner in a flash, his coat billowing behind him. He was running. Again. But this time, she wouldn't let him disappear. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she sprinted after him. Her pulse pounded in her ears. People cursed as she pushed past, knocking into shoulders, dodging bodies. Faster. He was only a few steps ahead. She reached out. Her fingers barely brushed the back of his coat. And then he was gone. Elena skidded to a stop. Her breath came in sharp gasps. She whipped around wildly, searching. Nothing. The street was busy, filled with cars and strangers, but Adrian had vanished. Again. No, her voice trembled. He was real. She had seen him. Tears burned in her eyes. Why? Why was he running from her? Why did he disappear on their wedding night? What was he hiding? She clenched her fists. No more waiting. No more crying over a man who had left her in the dark. She was going to find him. And this time, she wasn't letting go. Elena didn't sleep that night. Instead, she spent hours digging through the past, through every old email, text, and photo, searching for something she might have missed. Then she remembered. Adrian's mother. The way she had sounded the day after the wedding. The way she had said, just wait a little longer. Had she known something all along? Elena grabbed her keys. If Adrian's mother had answers, she was going to get them. Mrs. Carter's house, 10:12 a.m. The door opened just a crack. Elena. Mrs. Carter's voice was careful, cautious. It's been a while. Elena didn't waste time. I saw him. Mrs. Carter's face drained of color. I saw Adrian, Elena repeated, stepping forward. Yesterday. He ran. The older woman swallowed. You must be mistaken. Don't lie to me. Elena's voice was sharp, cutting. You knew, didn't you? You knew where he was this whole time. Mrs. Carter's lips pressed together. Elena, it's not that simple. Elena's chest tightened. Then make me understand. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Mrs. Carter sighed. Come inside. Elena stepped through the doorway, bracing herself. Whatever truth she was about to hear, it was going to change everything. Elena sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped so tightly they ached. Across from her, Mrs. Carter sighed, rubbing her temples as if preparing for a confession she never wanted to make. Elena, I never wanted you to find out this way. Find out what? Elena's voice was hoarse, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Carter hesitated. Then, in a whisper, she said, Adrian never meant to marry you. The words knocked the air from Elena's lungs. She blinked, disbelieving. What? Mrs. Carter wouldn't meet her eyes. His leaving, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was planned. Planned. The word echoed in Elena's head, slicing through her. Her lips trembled. No. No, that's not true. He loved me. Mrs. Carter's gaze softened with sorrow. I know, dear. And that's why he left. Elena's breath hitched. That doesn't make sense. If Adrian loved her, why would he leave? Why would he shatter her like this? Mrs. Carter took a deep breath. There was a reason he disappeared that night. But I can't be the one to tell you. Elena shot to her feet. Then, who can? Mrs. Carter reached into a drawer, pulled out a small, sealed envelope, and held it out to her. Adrian's handwriting was on the front. Elena. Her fingers shook as she took it. He left this for you, Mrs. Carter murmured. I wasn't supposed to give it to you unless you found him. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat and carefully tore it open. Her eyes darted over the first few lines. Then her world collapsed. My love, by the time you read this, you will hate me. And I deserve it. Elena's hands trembled. She forced herself to keep reading. I never should have married you. Not because I didn't love you, but because loving you put your life in danger. I left that night to protect you. If I had stayed, you wouldn't have made it to morning. Her breath caught. What? Her eyes flew over the words, desperate. The people I ran from found me. They knew about you. They would have come for you next. The only way to keep you safe was to disappear. Elena's vision blurred. People? What people? Adrian had never mentioned enemies, never hinted at being in danger. I never stopped loving you. I never will. But I'd rather you hate me forever than risk your life for my selfishness. Live, Elena. Be happy. Forget me. Adrian. The paper slipped from her fingers. Tears ran down her cheeks as she whispered his name. She had spent a year thinking he had abandoned her, that he had never loved her. But all this time, he had left to save her. And now, she had found him. And he had run again. No. This time, she wasn't letting him go. She wiped her tears and stood. If Adrian thought she was safer without him, he was wrong. Because now that she knew the truth, she would stop at nothing to bring him back. Elena clenched the letter in her trembling hands. He left to protect me. Her mind whirled with the revelation, every memory of Adrian now seen in a different light. The way he had held her tighter in the days before their wedding. The way he had kissed her like he was saying goodbye. The sadness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He had never stopped loving her. And he was still out there. Hiding. Suffering alone. Not anymore. She turned to Mrs. Carter, her voice sharp with determination. Tell me where he is. Mrs. Carter's lips parted in shock. Elena, no. I don't care how dangerous it is, Elena cut in. I don't care what he's running from. I deserve the truth. And if he won't come back to me, then I'll find him myself. A heavy silence settled between them. Then, Mrs. Carter's shoulders sagged in defeat. He never stopped asking about you. Elena's breath hitched. Mrs. Carter wiped at her eyes. I don't know where he is now, but I know where he's been before. There's a man, Luca. He was Adrian's best friend. If anyone can help you, it's him. Luca. The name sent a jolt through Elena. She had met him once, briefly, but Adrian had never spoken much about him. She straightened. Where can I find him? Mrs. Carter hesitated. Elena. I need to do this, she whispered. Finally, Mrs. Carter sighed and scribbled an address onto a notepad. Be careful, my dear. Elena took the paper with steady hands. She was done waiting for answers. This time, she would fight for the man she loved. The address led her to an old bookstore at the edge of the city. Elena pushed open the door, the scent of aged paper and dust filling the air. Behind the counter, a man in his 30s glanced up. His sharp, watchful eyes narrowed the moment he saw her. You're Adrian's wife. It wasn't a question. Elena's heart pounded. Where is he? Luca sighed, rubbing his jaw. You shouldn't be here. I don't care, she shot back. Tell me the truth. Luca studied her for a long moment. Then, in a low voice, he said, Adrian didn't just run away from you. He ran away from them. Elena stiffened. The people after him aren't the kind you escape from, Luca continued. He tried to leave that world behind for you, but they found him before the wedding. Her stomach twisted. Who are they? Luca exhaled. People who don't forgive betrayal. She swallowed hard. Where is he now? Luca hesitated. Elena's hands curled into fists. I deserve to know. After a long silence, Luca finally spoke. He's in a safe house. But if you go there, you're dragging yourself into his nightmare. Elena's heart clenched. She didn't care about the danger. Adrian had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. Now it was her turn to save him. She lifted her chin. Give me the address. Luca stared at her, searching her face. Then, with a sigh, he pulled out a slip of paper and wrote down an address. Elena took it with steady hands. She was going to find Adrian, and this time, she wouldn't let him run. Elena stood frozen as Adrian stared at her, his eyes a mix of shock and pain. She had found him, and yet, he wasn't rushing to hold her. He wasn't pulling her into his arms like she had dreamed he would. Instead, his knuckles were white as he gripped the doorframe, his entire body tense. You shouldn't be here. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Elena's breath hitched. That's the first thing you say to me after all these years? Adrian's jaw clenched. His eyes darted around, scanning the dark forest behind her. Did anyone follow you? She frowned. No. I made sure of it. He exhaled sharply, stepping back. Come inside. Elena hesitated. The man before her, he looked the same, yet different. His once neatly trimmed hair was slightly longer, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his eyes darker, haunted. But he was still Adrian, the man she had loved, the man who had left her. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The cabin was small, barely furnished, as if he was ready to leave at any moment. Adrian shut the door behind her, locking it. Elena turned to face him, her heart pounding. Why did you run? Adrian flinched. Elena, he ran a hand through his hair, looking away. You weren't supposed to find me. She swallowed hard. And yet I did. His eyes darkened, a storm brewing within them. Do you have any idea what you've done? What coming here means? I don't care, she shot back. You ran to protect me. But do you know what hurt me more? Not knowing the truth. Not knowing if you ever loved me. Adrian's breath hitched. I loved you then, she whispered. I love you now. His entire body tensed, his fists clenching at his sides. Elena, don't tell me to leave. She stepped closer. Because I won't. He took a sharp step back, as if her presence physically hurt him. You think love is enough? His voice was rough, filled with something raw. She blinked. It always was. Adrian let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You don't understand. Then make me understand. Her voice cracked, emotion overflowing. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, something in him broke. Adrian moved so fast, she barely had time to react. 1 second, he was standing away from her. The next, she was pinned against the wall, his hands braced beside her, caging her in. His scent, familiar, intoxicating, surrounded her. His face was inches from hers, his breath warm against her lips. Elena's heart pounded as she gazed up at him, her pulse racing. Adrian's voice was barely above a whisper. If you knew the things I've done, the monsters chasing me, you wouldn't be standing here telling me you love me. She didn't flinch. Instead, she cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. I don't care about your past. Her voice was steady, unwavering. I care about you. Something shattered in his expression. Elena, he looked like he wanted to say something, everything. But then, a loud crash sounded outside the cabin. Adrian's body stiffened. His eyes snapped toward the window, his muscles tensing like a predator sensing danger. "Elena," he whispered urgently. "Get down." Before she could react, he pulled her behind him, shielding her. And just like that, she realized the past wasn't the only thing haunting Adrian. Something, or someone had found them. A chilling silence filled the cabin. Adrian's body was coiled tight, every muscle rigid with tension. Elena's pulse pounded in her ears as she crouched behind him, her back pressed against the wall. She had seen him tense before, back when they were together, when he was overprotective in ways she didn't fully understand. But now he looked like a man prepared to kill. A shadow moved outside the window. Then, a slow, deliberate knock on the door. Knock, knock, knock. Elena's breath caught. Adrian didn't move. His hand hovered near his waistband, where she suddenly noticed a gun holstered against his hip. Who was outside? A friend? An enemy? And why did he look like he had been waiting for this? "Elena," Adrian whispered, so softly she barely heard him. "No matter what happens, stay behind me." She wanted to argue, to demand the truth, to force him to let her in on the secrets he had buried for years. But his eyes, dark, tormented, left no room for defiance. She gave a small nod. Adrian reached for the door handle, his movements slow and measured. Then, in one swift motion, he yanked the door open. A man stood outside, dressed in black, his face half hidden in the dim moonlight. Elena's breath stilled. The man smirked. "You're hard to find, Adrian." Adrian didn't react. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. "Then maybe you should have stopped looking." The man let out a low chuckle. "You know that's not how this works." Elena didn't miss the way Adrian's fingers twitched, a silent warning. But before she could speak, the man's gaze flickered to her. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. "Oh," the man murmured, tilting his head. His eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "This is interesting." Adrian stepped in front of her instantly. "She's got nothing to do with this." The man ignored him, still looking at Elena. "You're her. The one he left everything for." Her stomach dropped. What did he mean? "Leave." Adrian's voice was pure steel. "Now." But the man only smirked. "I just wanted to see it with my own eyes." The woman who made Adrian Wolfe disappear. Elena's fingers curled into fists. "Who are you?" The man chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't want to know." Adrian's body was tense as a loaded gun. "Your message is delivered. Now go." For a moment, the man just studied him. Then, with an amused shake of his head, he stepped back into the shadows. But before he disappeared into the darkness, he left her with one final sentence. "She deserves the truth, Adrian." Then he was gone. The night swallowed him whole, leaving only the echo of his words behind. Elena slowly turned to Adrian. He was still staring at the empty space where the man had stood, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. "Elena." No, her voice was barely above a whisper. "No more lies." Adrian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. She stepped closer, her heart thundering. "You left me on our wedding night. You vanished without a trace. I deserve to know why." His hands trembled at his sides. "Elena, tell me." Her voice cracked. "What are you running from?" He hesitated. For a long, agonizing moment, she thought he would push her away again. But then, he closed his eyes. And when he opened them, something inside him had shattered. "Elena," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I was never supposed to make it to the wedding." Her stomach twisted. "What?" Adrian swallowed hard. "That night, I wasn't running from you." A pause. "I was running for my life." Elena's heart pounded. Running for his life? Adrian's words echoed in her head, each syllable tightening the knot in her chest. She had imagined 1,000 possibilities for why he left. But this? She stepped closer, her hands trembling. "Adrian, what do you mean?" He exhaled shakily, his jaw clenched. "I never wanted to leave you, Elena. But that night, if I had stayed, you would have died." Her breath caught. "What?" Adrian took a deep, ragged breath, as if saying the words physically hurt. I was working undercover before we met. Deep in a world you can't even imagine. I did bad things to survive. To take down a group of people who destroy everything they touch. His voice cracked, haunted. I thought I got out. I thought I was free. His gaze lifted, piercing into hers. But I was wrong. Elena's throat tightened. Adrian's hands curled into fists. The night of our wedding, I got a message. A warning. His voice dropped to a whisper. They knew about you. Her blood ran cold. I had two choices, Adrian said, his voice raw. Stay and watch them kill you, or disappear and make them think I was dead. Tears blurred Elena's vision. Why didn't you tell me? Because they were watching. His hands shook. Because if I even hinted at the truth, you wouldn't have been safe. She let out a broken laugh, wiping her tears. And you think leaving me like that was better? Adrian swallowed hard. It killed me, Elena. Every single day. I watched you from a distance, making sure they didn't come after you. I was ready to step in the second they did. But they never did, because they believed I was gone. Elena's chest ached. And now? Adrian hesitated. They know I'm alive. The weight of his words sank in. She finally understood. Why he disappeared. Why he stayed away. Why he looked haunted every time she said she loved him. Because he loved her too. Enough to destroy himself for her. Tears slid down her cheeks as she took a shaky step forward. You should hate me, Adrian whispered, looking away. Elena grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. I should, she whispered. But I don't. His breath hitched. I spent years loving a ghost, she murmured. But now you're here. Her voice trembled. So tell me, Adrian, do you still love me? Adrian's walls shattered. In a heartbeat, his hands cradled her face, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. Then, his forehead rested against hers. I never stopped, he admitted, his voice breaking. God, I never stopped. Elena's chest tightened. She had spent years in pain, lost in the wreckage of his disappearance. But now, she saw the truth. He had been lost too. And yet, against all odds, they had found each other again. Her lips trembled. Then don't run. Adrian's breath hitched. Elena. Stay. She gripped his hands. No more running. We face this together. His arms wrapped around her, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him breathing. I love you, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Elena closed her eyes, sinking into him. No matter what dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. This time, he was never letting go. 3 years later, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. A soft breeze carried the scent of salt water as the waves lapped gently against the shore. Elena stood barefoot in the sand, watching the ocean stretch endlessly before her. A warm arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a familiar chest. Adrian. His lips brushed against her temple, sending a shiver down her spine. Lost in thought, she smiled, leaning into him, just thinking about how far we've come. He hummed in agreement, his chin resting on her shoulder. 3 years ago, I thought I'd never have this. Neither had she. After Adrian's enemies resurfaced, they had faced a battle for survival. There had been nights filled with fear, days spent on the run, and moments when Elena had wondered if love was enough to keep them together. But they had fought. Together. And now they had won. Are you happy? She whispered, turning in his arms to meet his gaze. Adrian's dark eyes softened, filled with something deep, something unbreakable. With you? Always. She smiled, tracing her fingers along his jaw. No more ghosts from the past. Adrian exhaled, his grip tightening around her. They're gone. For good. The final battle had been brutal, but they had emerged stronger. Adrian had used every skill he had to take down the men who had hunted him for years. And when the dust settled, he had chosen this life. A quiet, peaceful life by the sea, with her. Elena cupped his face, her voice a whisper. Then let's never look back. Adrian smiled, a rare, genuine smile. Agreed. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of desperation or fear. It was a kiss of forever. As the waves crashed around them, their past faded into the distance. The scars remained, but so did their love. And, this time, nothing could take it away.